Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, death slaves, service peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, banker scum. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. Let's go global and look at this new report that came out about from the Office of Financial Research, a unit of the Treasury, and this was created under Dodd-Frank. And what it shows is that the 2016 Financial Stability Report revealed that regulators have failed again to mitigate banking risks. No surprise there. And so this was really interesting to me because this goes into some detail about U.S. exposure, U.S. banks' exposure to weakness in the Eurozone, particularly the European banking system. And this becomes all the more notable and important when we look at the fact that Italian banks are imploding right now, and they're desperately trying to put some kind of a bailout, bail-in package together, but it's a race against time. And then we also have, of course, banking problems around the Eurozone, and also of course, the effects we're going to have from Brexit. And then Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank's kind of on its knees as well, and so it's very important to bear in mind what the exposure of U.S. banks is if things go down. And it turns out their exposure is huge, much more than I imagine. And I've done other videos on this and looked at the exposure, and of course a lot of American banks have had the chance to wind down some of their positions and decrease their exposure, but as it turns out they've also been taking riskier exposure with derivatives and credit default swaps involved with European banks. So anyway, let's get into the gruesome details. Like I like to say, U.S. global systemically important banks have $2 trillion in exposures to European banks, and half of that is off the balance sheet. And that's why we didn't get an accurate number before. All this stuff is done in part of the shadow banking system. So $2 trillion of total exposures, and then on top of that, U.S. banks have sold more than $800 billion in notional value of credit derivatives related to Europe. And as usual, the exact details and amounts of the counterparty's exposure are not revealed. This is a problem. Let me remind you that this is exactly what happened in the last financial crash, when AIG had to be covered with $180 billion in taxpayer money, and then trillions in behind-the-scenes federal loan extensions and cheap money, etc. And it's what ended up, that counterparty risk is what ended up crashing the U.S. economy, arguably, and the global economy. And now we find out that, of course, these derivatives and this exposure are at epic levels again. And so let's see. In the article it says, quote, at the end of 2015, U.S. life insurers' derivatives exposure, as reported in statutory filings, totaled $2 trillion in notional value. This $2 trillion does not include the derivative contracts held in affiliated insurers, non-insurance affiliates, and parent companies that do not have to file statutory statements. Details are not publicly available, unquote. So there we have it. So not only do we have $2 trillion of direct exposure, U.S. banks, to all the problems in Europe, but we also have at least $800 billion of derivatives contracts that could also explode. And the counterparties, of course, in all these contracts are those same Wall Street banks who have their own separate exposure to European bank risk. So $2 trillion is really just the beginning of it when you factor everything else in. 9 U.S. and Euro banks hold 60% of this risk. Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Citigroup, Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, Barclays, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, the usual cast of characters. And the bottom line here, and that's the most disturbing, is the fact that, of course, we had this gigantic financial crash 6, 7, 8 years ago now. I'm starting to lose track. And even with the introduction of some minimal reforms, of course, the entire system is more riskier than ever, as it turns out. And part of the problem is the fact that the oversight regulatory agencies don't do their job; they're co-opted, and then the fact that a lot of the numbers we need are just not available. And the report goes on to say exactly that. Quote, deficiencies in data and data management remain a critical vulnerability data needs remain unfulfilled, particularly in shadow banking markets. Many of the new data are not ready or available for analysis. Despite progress, the probability remains high that data deficiencies will again prevent risk managers and regulators from assessing risk before it is too late, unquote. So let's put that in English. All the banks are out of control. All the banks are taking more risks than ever. They're in more debt than ever. They're more leverage than ever. They have more derivative contracts than ever. And there's no way to know the real numbers. And they all cook their books. And the regulatory agencies that oversee them don't give a shit because they're part of the machinery. So anyway, there you have it. $2 trillion of exposure to European banks in these big banks. And then on top of that, unknown amount of exposure, including 800 billion in derivatives. I mean, what, as I often say, and everyone else says, what could go wrong? I don't know. I'm useful, lady. Don't you be one too.